8,000 tons of aluminium a year. In 1909, one factory at the head of a West Highland sea loch made more aluminium than every other smelter in Britain put together. There was no railway to it, there was no road to it either, not one that a cart could safely use. The nearest railway station lay on the far side of a mountain range, a long day away. Everything the works needed came in by boat, up a long, narrow arm of the sea. And yet every single house in the village around that factory had electric light. Not gas, not paraffin lamps. Electric light in every room, wired in from the day the houses were finished. Whole British cities would wait another 30 years for that. This village had it before the First World War, at the end of a footpath. The people who lived there called it the Electric Village, and the name stuck for a century. They will still tell you it was the first village on earth where every house was connected. Kinlochleven in Loch in the West Highlands of Scotland. A place that did not exist as a village in 1900 and held well over 1,000 people within a generation. It was built for one purpose by one company around one factory. For 91 years, the pots inside that factory never once went cold. Metal was poured here through 2 world wars, through the slump, and through the long decline that came after. And then, in June 2000, the last metal was tapped, the current was cut, and the buildings came down. The village is still there. The reason for the village is not. Come down off the mountain pass above the village on a wet afternoon, and you see it before you see any houses. 6 enormous steel pipes running straight down the bare mountainside, side by side into the trees. They are still there. They are still full of water. Keep them in mind, because we will come back to them. Because the distance between 8,000 tons a year and an empty gravel field is the whole of this story. Chapter 1. The head of the loch. To understand why anyone built a factory here, you first have to understand how little was here before. Lochleven is a sea loch that cuts inland from the coast of Argyll, deep and narrow and shut in by mountains on both sides. At its very head, where the river Leven comes down out of the hills, there were 2 small settlements and very little else. Kinlochmoor on the north bank, Kinlochbeg on the south. In Gaelic, the place is Kinlochleven, the head of Lochleven. And that river was not only a river, it was a county boundary, and the 2 hamlets stood in 2 different counties. North of the water was Inverness-shire, south of it was Argyll. One village would later be born straddling both. For most of recorded history, this was drovers' country. Black cattle walked south to the trysts, and the tracks here were made for hooves. There was an inn here in the 18th century, and by about 1900, 2 shooting lodges, and almost nothing else at all. The military roads built after the Jacobite risings passed nearby, but they only passed by. They did not come down here. One of them climbs the pass above the village in a series of brutal zigzags that the soldiers who built it are said to have named the Devil's Staircase. That name is much older than the factory, but for a few years thousands of men would use that staircase to get to work. Above and behind the head of the loch stands the Moors Range, and beyond that a high, wet, empty plateau. That plateau is one of the wettest places in Britain. Rain falls on it for something close to 250 days a year. For a farmer, that rain was a curse. For a shepherd, it was a hard living. Nobody had ever thought of it as an asset. Then somebody worked out that if you gathered that rain behind a wall and then dropped it 900 feet, it became something else entirely. It became power. Continuous, free, self-renewing power. In a country whose west coast had almost no coal of its own. And power, at the very end of the 19th century, had suddenly become the one thing standing between a strange new metal and the world. That metal is the reason for everything that follows. And in 1886, almost nobody in the world could afford to own any of it. Chapter 2. The Patent. Aluminium is the most common metal in the crust of the earth. It is in the clay of your garden, in the rock of every hillside, in the dust on your boots. And yet, you will never find a lump of it lying about, because it is always locked into oxide. For most of the 19th century, prizing it out of that oxide was a laboratory trick, not an industry. Chemists in Denmark, Germany and France coaxed out grains and buttons of it and were astonished by how light it was. The famous story is that the Emperor Napoleon III kept a set of aluminium cutlery for his most honored guests. Everybody else, so the story goes, had to make do with gold. In 1884, the builders of the Washington Monument capped it with a small pyramid of aluminium weighing about 100 ounces. At the time, that lump of metal cost roughly what the same weight of silver would have cost. Then, in 1886, two young men on opposite sides of the Atlantic solved the problem within months of each other. Charles Martin Hall was working in a woodshed in Ohio. Paul Héroult was working in France. Both were 22 years old. Both had been born in 1863. Both would die in 1914. Their answer was the same. Dissolve purified alumina in a bath of molten cryolite, then run an enormous current through it. The current tears the metal out of the oxide, and it gathers as a shining pool on the floor of the cell. 2 years later, Karl Bayer patented a cheap way of making that purified alumina from bauxite ore. Between them, those two patents turned a precious curiosity into an ordinary industrial material. But there was a catch, and the catch is the whole reason this village exists. The process is monstrously hungry for electricity. Modern smelters swallow something like 13 to 15,000 units of power for every ton of metal. The early ones swallowed far more than that. Aluminium was less a metal than electricity in a solid form. So the men who wanted to make it did not go looking for ore, they went looking for power. On the 7th of May 1894, the British Aluminium Company was registered in London. It bought the British and colonial rights to the two patents that mattered, and then it went north. Not to the coalfields of England or Wales, where power was made by burning things. To the highlands of Scotland, where it could be made by dropping water. Their first works went up at Foyers, on the eastern shore of Loch Ness, where a river fell hard out of the hills. The first British aluminium was cast there in 1895, and the first hydropowered smelter opened the following year. It was not universally welcomed. The Falls of Foyers were a celebrated beauty spot, and there were furious letters about what industry would do to them. It is one of the oldest arguments in the Highlands, and you will hear it again before this story is over. Foyers, though, was small. Within a few years, the company wanted a plant several times its size. For that, they needed a bigger catchment, a bigger fall, and somewhere nobody would object too loudly. They found all three on a wet plateau behind the Mamores, at a river called the Blackwater. Chapter 3: The Blackwater. The plateau east of the Mamores is not beautiful in any comfortable way. It is peat and bog and black water, and for most of the year it is being rained on. The engineers looked at that and saw a basin, a shallow trough holding a chain of small lochs. Wall of the narrow outlet at one end, and all of those lochs became a single reservoir 8 miles long. Behind that wall they could gather the rain falling on roughly 60 square miles of hill, and that reservoir would sit more than 1,000 feet above the head of Kinlochleven. That difference in height is the entire business plan. Water at the top, a factory at the bottom. In 1904, an Act of Parliament created the Kinlochleven Water and Electric Power Company to build it. It sat inside the British Aluminium Group alongside the North British Aluminium Company, and the works would carry both names over the years. The design came from Thomas Mike and Sons, the practice of the engineer brothers Patrick and Charles Mike. Sir Alexander Binney advised. The chief assistant resident engineer on the ground was a young man called William Halcrow. His name would end up on one of the great British engineering firms of the 20th century. The dam they designed was not tall. It was long, 3,112 feet of mass concrete. That is more than half a mile of wall, 86 feet high, holding back a plateau's worth of rain. It was the longest dam in the Highlands. The Highland record even calls it the largest of its kind in Europe at the time. There was no road to the site and no railway to the site, so they built machinery to hang in the air instead. Aerial cableways carried materials along the works on trestles that range from 10 feet to 130 feet high. They even built a small temporary hydro plant, a single water wheel of about 250 kilowatts, to power the building of the big one. Everything else came up the loch by boat and then went up the hill by whatever means could be improvised. The whole scheme cost about £600,000, which is something like 60 million in today's money. And it needed one more thing that could not be shipped in crates or hung from a cableway. It needed men. Thousands of them on a bare moor in the worst weather in Britain for 4 years. Chapter 4: The Navvies. The word is short for navigators, and it is nearly 200 years old. It belonged to the men who dug the canals and then to the men who built the railways, moving country to country with a bundle and a shovel. By 1905, that world was almost over. The great railway earthworks were finished, the machines were coming, and the wandering armies of labor were breaking up. The Blackwater is often called the last great work of the traditional navy. About 3,000 men worked on the scheme, and most of them were Irish. There were Highlanders and Lowland Scots, Englishmen, Welshmen, Scandinavians, and men who gave no name at all. They lived where they worked. There was no village to lodge in and nowhere to walk home to, so the company and the men between them threw up a settlement of huts along the line of the dam. Tarred timber, felled roofs, iron stoves, bunks in tiers. Boots dried by the stove overnight and were wet again by 9 in the morning. In photographs, the whole place looks temporary, because it was. The weather up there is the thing that people who have not stood on that moor cannot quite believe. Rain for most of the year, snow from October, and a wind with nothing to slow it down for 20 miles. Work went on in it anyway. Concrete was mixed and placed, spoil was shifted, and the wall crept along the outlet of the basin a few feet at a time. Getting to the job was itself a journey. The nearest railway stations were Coror and Rannoch on the West Highland line, and both of them are hours of open moor away from the dam. From the west, the way in was the old military zigzag, the Devil's Staircase, and then a long walk over the shoulder of the hills. Men arrived at the works already soaked and already tired. There was no public house on the site. The nearest was the old Drovers Inn out on the edge of Rannoch Moor, which meant a walk of miles across the bog and back. Men made that walk in all weathers, and not all of them came back. Some were caught out in blizzards on ground where there is nothing at all to shelter behind. Others were killed on the works itself, as men were on every great earthwork of that century. About 500 yards west of the dam, there is a small enclosure on the moor where they were buried. There are 22 markers there, cast in concrete because there was concrete to hand. Only 7 of them carry a name. The rest simply record that somebody is buried there, and that nobody knew who. The names that were recorded are ordinary ones. A John McFadden, a John Mackenzie, a man known to his workmates only as Darky Cunningham. On a job like that, a nickname was often the only name a man had. He was paid by it, and if the worst happened, he was buried under it. We know as much as we do about that camp because of one of the men who worked in it. He was a boy from Donegal, and he became the reason this place has a literature at all. Patrick McGill was born near Glenties in County Donegal at the very end of the 1880s. He was one of 11 children in a 2-roomed cottage on poor ground. At about 12 years old, he was taken to a hiring fair and hired out for 6 months to a farmer. He was, in the plainest sense, sold for the season. From there, it was the usual road out. Potato picking in Scotland, then truck work on the railways, then the great scheme in the hills where the money was said to be better. So McGill came to the Blackwater and he worked there, and at night, in a hut full of exhausted men, he taught himself to write. In March 1914, his book was published. Children of the Dead End, the autobiography of a navvy, told through a Donegal boy called Dermot Flynn. It sold in tens of thousands, and it did something almost nothing else had done. It described that camp from the inside, in the voice of a man who had lived in it. Be careful with it though, as historians are. It is a novel drawn from a life, not a witness statement, and McGill moved things around. But some of what he describes lines up exactly with events recorded on the site, including one incident set down as happening to an Inverness man in April 1908. What survives of the camp today is almost nothing. Refused pits with broken shovels and rusted tins, the lines of hut foundations in the pit, and the graves. Everything those men built, though, is still working. That is the strange arithmetic of this place, and it takes us to the next chapter. Chapter 5. The Current. Water was first held behind the wall in 1907, and a temporary smelter was already running that year while the main works were finished. Getting the water from the reservoir to the factory is the part that engineers still admire. It does not simply fall down the hill, it is walked along it. From the dam, a covered concrete conduit about 8 feet square carries the flow 3.5 miles around the flank of the hill. It falls only a foot in every 1,000 along that stretch. All the height is saved for the end. Then it goes over the edge. 6 steel pipes, each 39 inches across and more than 5,000 feet long, run straight down the mountainside to the works. The total fall from conduit to powerhouse is 935 feet. Those are the pipes you saw at the start of this film. At the bottom, the water hit 11 Pelton wheels supplied by Escher Wyss of Zurich. Each wheel drove a pair of generators built by Dick Kerr and Company of Preston. Together, they produce something over 25,000 kilowatts, running at high load almost all year round. In a normal year, the station made around 160 million units of electricity. It was the largest hydroelectric power station in Britain of its day, and nearly all of it went into one building next door. That is the other thing about a smelter. It needs direct current, so there was no point in sending the power anywhere. The factory had to sit at the foot of the pipes. So the works were built where the water landed, on flat ground at the head of the loch, on both banks of the river, in two counties at once. In 1909, the main works opened. Within a short time, it was producing around 8,000 tons of aluminium a year. That was more than every other smelter in Britain put together, which is where the story began. But a factory is not a village. Somebody now had to persuade several hundred families to come and live at the end of a footpath in the wettest corner of Scotland and stay. Chapter 6: The Electric Village. A company that builds a factory in an empty glen has a problem it usually does not have. There is nowhere for the workforce to sleep. So the British Aluminium Company did what mill owners and ironmasters had been doing for a century and built the village itself. Straight streets on the flat ground, rows of small solid houses, and a factory at the end of them. Houses went up on both banks of the river, so the old hamlets of Kinlochleven and Kinlochleven quietly turned into one place with one name. Kinlochleven had come into existence. And then came the detail that made it famous. Every one of those houses was wired for electric light from the beginning, as a matter of course. This was not generosity, and the company never pretended it was. It was arithmetic. The power station next door was making far more electricity than the pots could swallow, and in 1909 there was no national grid to sell the surplus into. Electricity that is not used is simply wasted, so the surplus went into the houses, into the streets, and into the workshops, because there was nothing else to do with it. The result was a village that was, for its time, extraordinary. Electric light in every room, in every house, electric street lamps along the roads, at a moment when most of rural Scotland was still trimming wicks. Villages a few miles down the coast would wait for the hydro schemes of the 1940s and 50s to get what Kinlochleven had before the First World War. That is where the nickname comes from. The Electric Village, and the claim, repeated ever since and still repeated in the village today, that this was the first place on earth where every single house was connected. Because power was cheap here and coal had to come by boat, people cooked and heated with electricity decades before that was normal anywhere else in Britain. The village skipped the whole era of domestic life. There were shops, a school, a hall, football, a pipe band and a bowling green, and a company that owned a great deal of it. That is the bargain of every company village, and the people who lived here understood it perfectly well. There was one more peculiarity, and it is the sort of thing that only Britain produces. The river running through the middle of the village was a county boundary. North of the bridge you were in Inverness-shire, south of it you were in Argyll. One village, two county councils, two sets of paperwork for most of the 20th century. That only ended with the local government reorganization of 1975, which finally swept both banks into one Highland authority. Until then, the village was administratively two places pretending to be one, and still, for years, there was no road. If you lived here before the First World War, you left by steamer, down the loch to Ballachulish, and you came home the same way. The railway never came to the village at all. The nearest station was at Ballachulish, and in 1908 it was renamed to make the connection clear to travelers. From there it was still a boat trip or a very long walk. A village that made the most modern metal in the world could only be reached the way people had reached it in 1750. The road that finally solved it was built during the First World War, and it was built by German prisoners of war. There was a camp here between 1916 and 1919, holding German prisoners and a number of British conscientious objectors. They cut the road along the south side of Loch Leven from Glencoe, and they worked on the pipeline running from the Blackwater. The road was finished in 1919, One of the little bridges still carries a plaque recording that German prisoners built it in that year. It is one of the quietest war memorials in Scotland, and most people drive over it without noticing. Picture that village street on a wet October evening in 1926. The hooter has gone at the works, and there is the sound of boots on the road, hundreds of pairs of them, all moving the same way. There is a smell in the air that everyone who grew up here remembers, and nobody can quite describe. Part burnt carbon, part hot metal, part rain on hot iron. Above the roofs, the mountains are already black. Behind the village, the 6 pipes are invisible in the dark, but they are full, and they will be full at 3 in the morning, and at 3 in the morning the pots will still be running. Chapter 7. The Pot Room. Because that is the thing about a smelter that outsiders never quite grasp. It cannot stop. A reduction pot holds a bath of molten salts at something close to 1,000 degrees. Let the current fail for long enough, and the whole thing freezes into a solid block of rubbish. Then it has to be dug out with picks and rebuilt from the lining upwards, which takes days and costs a fortune. So the works ran day and night, every day of the year, for 91 years. That is why the village lived on shifts. Not the 6 days on and Sunday off of a mill town, but a rota that never left the machine unattended, at Christmas or at 3 in the morning. The factory itself was a long block of sheds holding rows of pots, with a warehouse, a laboratory, and a carbon works alongside. The Highland record lists the main block as rows of 76 smelters. The carbon works mattered more than the name suggests. The anodes hanging in every pot are made of carbon, and they burn away as the metal is made, so they have to be replaced again and again. Making a ton of aluminium consumes something like half a ton of carbon along with it. A smelter is not one factory. It is 2 factories that have to live next door to one another. The white powder that fed the pots came in by sea. British Aluminium made its alumina at Larne in the north of Ireland, and, from 1917, at Burnt Island in Fife. The ore behind that powder came largely from bauxite workings in the south of France, in which the company had taken a controlling interest as early as 1898. A Highland village at the end of a footpath was tied into a supply chain that crossed a continent. Between the pier and the works ran one of the best footnotes in Scottish industrial history. A 3-foot gauge railway, opened in 1906, worked by electricity from an overhead wire. It is generally reckoned the first electric railway in Scotland, and it ran on into 1960. Little 4-wheeled locomotives from Dick Kerr of Preston, humming between the sheds, half a century before that was ordinary anywhere. The work in the pot room was hot, heavy and dusty, and it went on in a fog of fume that men breathed for whole careers. This was ordinary industrial life at the time, and it was hard on the people who did it. At the end of the line, the metal was tapped, carried in ladles and poured into molds, and stacked as plain silver-grey bars. In later years, the works made its name on very high-purity metal in particular. Then the bars went back down the loch by boat, out into a country that was learning to want aluminium for everything, and about to want it very badly indeed. Chapter 8. The War Metal. Aluminium had one property that made it irresistible to the 20th century. It is astonishingly light, and lightness turned out to matter more than anyone expected. A metal that is strong for its weight is a metal you can fly with, and in 1914 the world discovered that it very much wanted to fly. The First World War turned the works at the head of Kinlochleven from a bold industrial experiment into something the government cared about a great deal. Demand rose, and so did the pressure on the water supply. During the war, the catchment feeding the reservoir was enlarged to around 66 square miles. More burns were caught, more rain was gathered, and the prisoners of war in the camp below worked on the pipeline that carried it. War pays for infrastructure that peace argues about for decades. Afterwards, the company thought bigger again. In 1921, it obtained powers for a 3rd smelter at Loch, north of Fort William, on a scale that made Kinlochleven look modest. That scheme meant driving a water tunnel for miles through the mountains, and it began producing metal in 1929. From then on, Kinlochleven was the company's older, smaller works. That is a quiet sentence with a long shadow. From 1929 onwards, there was always somewhere newer, and every decision about investment would be made with that in mind. Through the 1930s, while a great deal of industrial Britain stood idle, the pots here kept running. A village tied to one factory is fragile, but a factory that cannot be switched off is also a strange kind of security. Then came the Second War, and aluminium stopped being a useful material and became a strategic one. Aircraft production is, in the end, a question of how much light metal a country can make. You may know the famous appeal of 1940 for saucepans to be turned into aeroplanes. It was tremendous for morale, and a good deal of what came in was never usable. The metal that actually mattered came out of places like this one, quietly, ton after ton, from a shed at the foot of a Scottish mountain. The dam and the power station were treated as assets worth guarding. Far from anywhere is a good place to keep something that a country cannot afford to lose. The 1950s and 60s are the years the village remembers best, and they are the years most of the photographs come from. Full employment, full houses, a school with plenty of children in it, wages that were steady, a works that never closed, a bus down the loch on a Saturday, and everybody's father or brother or uncle inside the same gate. In 1975, the new bridge at Ballachulish opened, and the ferry queues at the Narrows ended. Traffic that had once trickled round the head of the loch stopped coming through. It was a small change with a long tail. The village had been a place you passed through on the way somewhere. Now it was a place you had to mean to visit. Chapter 9. The Last Pot. Nothing dramatic killed these works. There was no fire, no flood, no crash, no single villain. What killed it was scale, and scale is a very boring assassin. By the 1970s, the world's new smelters were being built 10 times bigger than this one. They were built beside enormous power stations, on deep water, with pot lines a third of a mile long. A plant limited to what one Highland reservoir could deliver could not follow them. The technology told the same story. The equipment in these sheds was of a generation that the industry had already moved past, and rebuilding it here made no commercial sense to anybody. In 1982, British Aluminium and the British business of the Canadian company Alcan were brought together, and the works passed into a much larger international group. Then, in 1994, the announcement came. The company said the smelter would close around the turn of the century, and it gave the reasons plainly. Changing international patterns of demand, outdated technology, economies of scale. 3 flat phrases, and the end of the reason a village existed. What made this closure unusual is that everyone knew it was coming, 6 years ahead. Most industrial towns in Britain got their news in a single morning. And here, the story turns on its cruelest detail. While the smelter was winding down, the company was spending heavily on the power station beside it. Between 1996 and 2000, the 11 old wheels were replaced by 3 modern turbines of 10 megawatts each. The water was worth investing in. The factory was not. The workforce had already been falling for years. At its height, the smelter had employed something over 700 people. The village trust puts it higher still, at more than 800 at times. By March 1999, there were 96 people left working in it. A works that had once been the whole point of the place had shrunk to the size of a small firm. In June 2000, the current was taken off the last pots. The metal was tapped for the last time, and the pots that had never been allowed to go cold went cold. 91 years, almost to the month, from the opening of the works in 1909. And then, over the following years, most of the buildings were taken down. The pot rooms went, the chimneys went, the skyline of the village changed for the first time in nearly a century, and it changed by subtraction. In 1991, there had been just over 1,000 people here in around 420 households. By 2010, the estimate was about 830, and by 2020, around 760. That is not a collapse, it is a slow leak, and it is what usually happens when the reason for a place is removed, but the place is still standing. Chapter 10. What the water still turns. Begin with the part of the story that never stopped. The power station at the foot of those pipes is still working today. It was rebuilt in stages between 1996 and 2000, and it has been operated since. 3 modern turbines now do the work that 11 water wheels used to do. Its capacity is somewhere around 27 megawatts, and the electricity goes out into the national grid. Some of it travels north to the smelter at Fort William that outlived this one. In 2004, the powerhouse was given the highest grade of protection Scotland awards a building. The machinery hall that made this village possible is now itself a protected monument. The 6 pipes on the hillside are the ones from the beginning of this film. They are still bolted to their stone saddles and they are still full of moving water. Rain that fell on the moor this morning is somewhere inside them now. Up on the plateau, the dam stands exactly where the navvies left it. Half a mile of concrete, 86 feet high, holding back an inland sea of peat water. You can walk out to it. Almost everybody who does arrives soaked. About 500 yards to the west, the little enclosure is still there too. 22 markers, 7 names. The others unknown then and unknown now. It is one of the loneliest places in Scotland to stand and take your hat off. Patrick McGeo's book is still in print, well over a century after it appeared. It is still the nearest thing we have to a voice from inside those huts. Down in the village, the ground where the work stood is mostly flat and open. Grass, gravel, foundation lines, and a great deal of sky where the sheds used to be. A few structures survived, mostly because heavy concrete is expensive to knock down. The tall carbon silos were converted in 2002 into something nobody could have predicted. In 2003, an ice climbing center opened inside the old carbon works. For years it held the largest indoor ice wall in the world, a tower of real ice in the shed where the carbon blocks were once stored. The Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh formally opened it in June 2005. It closed in March 2023. A community operator now hopes to reopen it. A small brewery has worked in an old coke bunker on the site since 2011. Beer made with the same water that used to be used to make metal. The village also kept a museum of itself called